Hello everyone, and welcome to the second episode of From the Author's Chair. I'm Sarah Kate Ishii, an indie author based in Brisbane, and I started this podcast to share a bit about the life of an author, provide tips on some of the unseen sides of being an author, and also to create a more connected author-reader space, because sometimes I feel social media can be a bit isolating or wooden. In each episode, I want to begin with a free audiobook narration of my debut fantasy novel, Dynasty Codes Book 1, Origin Curse. Before we do dig into Chapter 2 today, I just want to say how much I've already learned in this process. I'm by no means a pro at audio recording or editing, but the hands-on experience has been eye-opening. For example, in just these 2 sessions already, I've learned so much about breath control, the best room in my house to record in, even which cup to put my water in. Because there's nothing like unbottling like one of those screw-top metal water bottles in the middle of a long recording session and seeing just how long that takes on the audio recording timeline. I'll be sharing a bit more of these insights as we go, and other bits that are involved in author life, but today I just want to emphasise that being an indie author is a journey. It's not just about the book that you create, although that is such an amazing part to hold it at the end, but it's also about what you learn and who you become along the way. It sounds so cheesy now that I'm putting it into words, but it really is how I feel. Alright, so let's get to it today. We read the intro and Chapter 1 of Origin Curse last time, so now it's time to jump into Chapter 2.
Chapter 2 Omens. Yoshiko shuffled deeper into the castle gardens, down winding paths and past neat bushes and ponds, reaching a bed of blue flowers and crouching to admire them closer, breathing in their light, sweet scent. They were spectacular, small, with 5 sky blue petals blending to white in the centre. She remembered the year before when her father had tried making them into tea, creating a light blue infusion with a sweet, delicate taste. Yoshiko chuckled and wondered whether she should try making the tea again, turning to ask what Suki thought, only to see Suki staring wide-eyed in awe at the blue flowers. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Yoshiko poked a drop of water from an indigo petal. "I've never seen anything like them before," Suki admitted, her prim face softening. "They're blue." "They're my favourites. Mother brought their seeds back from a trip to another region, wanting to plant them in the garden to surprise my father. They only flower once a year. It's one of our favourite times." She looked back at Suki, wondering whether she was talking too much, before continuing. "He was meant to see them with me. We'd planned to sit with tea and a snack together, paint, all right, or just watch the world go by. Blue flowers are so unusual. It feels like a fantasy." Suki agreed. "I heard the Lord Hitoshi is away for a political trip?" "Yes," Yoshiko said slowly, once again thinking about what Chinnen had said a moment ago. "Is that why you brought the paints?" Suki held out the wooden box, head tilted to one side, lips pulling slightly into a soft smile. Yoshiko smiled. Maybe Suki would be a wonderful addition to the palace, and perhaps she and Haruki would get along. "You're right. I wanted to paint them so he could see them." Then, to make sure they could keep talking, she pushed Suki a little more. "Where do you think I should sit to get the best view?" Suki looked about, her lovely face becoming serious. She crouched further to Yoshiko's left and narrowed her eyes to focus on the view before looking round-eyed again at Yoshiko. "How about here? You can see that tree behind them." Yoshiko agreed and asked Suki to help her set up her inks and cushion where Suki had suggested. She felt her father would appreciate Suki's choice. Upon hearing the news her father would be away for so long, Yoshiko had been sad she'd missed this opportunity with him, though she knew he had to attend the talks. When she'd expressed her disappointment to her mother over tea together one day, her mother had laughed pleasantly and suggested that Yoshiko paint them for him. That way, he could look at 3 of his favourite things at the same time: nature, paintings, and something made by his beloved daughter. Yoshiko loved the idea. It was as expected of her mother, one of the wisest people Yoshiko knew. So, here she was, kneeling on a cushion outside, idly chewing the end of her ink brush and wondering where to begin. What should she show her father about these flowers? He knew what they looked like. He'd inked and written about them many times before. So how would Yoshiko show him her representation of them instead? A flower dipped with a pearl of water on it. A thought came to her. She wanted to show him how, even with yesterday's heavy rains, these flowers had used their energy to grow more beautiful than before. Yoshiko wondered whether her inking skills could capture the water droplets too, and she tentatively looked back at Suki for a moment, wondering whether the young girl would get bored standing there for long. She seemed content, fiddling with the blue sleeve of her kimono again and looking around, so Yoshiko turned back and tried to focus. But, as she lifted her brush and took a meditative breath before making the first careful stroke of indigo on light brown rice paper, a gust of wind blew up. It rushed through the flowers and knocked an inkpot over. Suki made a strangled cry of disappointment and hurried to pick it up, calling to Yoshiko to ask if anything had spilt on her. Yoshiko barely noticed her questions. She remained still, listening. Something she couldn't quite identify stirred on the wind. A sound she thought she should know rang at the edge of her hearing range. Her brush remained frozen in her hand, and a patch of indigo ink bled where it had dropped onto the yellow of her kimono. It went unnoticed as the sound came closer, and Yoshiko's sensitive cursed hearing picked up on the noise. Hooves crashed on the main road through the town through the northeastern road towards the castle compound, and her father's escort blared their horn to sound their arrival. "Come on!" Yoshiko cried out to Suki, who fell behind and looked panicked at the idea of running, trying to make more legroom in her kimono. Even after such a short distance down the curving paths of the castle gardens, the young maid's neat hair strayed from its place, and she awkwardly shuffled in her zori. Yoshiko was having the same problem, so she chose the easiest and most ungraceful option, kicking off her zori and pulling her kimono from her ankles to her knees, giving more room to run. She wished she'd worn her hakama after all. Hearing the horn again, and the crash of hooves closer in the town, Yoshiko sped up and dashed out of the gardens, forgetting her poor maid who dropped behind, desperately trying to keep up with her reckless charge. People all over the compound stopped to listen, the sound of the horses crashing closer and within hearing range of the average person. Heart beating wildly, Yoshiko grinned and darted around the corner of the same castle level towards the stables and the Karametimon gate that protected the rear northern entrance of the castle compounds. She saw her father's banners, a simple black circle to represent the sun, and a curled-up indigo dragon, the E family's symbol, on white cloth. As a group of horses, samurai, and diplomats clattered over the bridge and through the Karametimon entrance, slowing to a stop as castle workers and stable boys rushed to meet them. Yoshiko eagerly scanned for her father's gorgeous black mare amongst the smarting, panting throng of horses being gently walked around the stone entryway to cool down after their journey. Her mother had given Hitoshi the mare for their unison anniversary celebrations a couple of years ago, and Yoshiko would recognize the beautiful horse and its ebony shine anywhere. But the mare wasn't there. Yoshiko stalled. Now she looked closer. The group seemed too small. Her father's two guardians, who went almost everywhere with him, were missing too. She frowned and tried to think. Perhaps they'd arrived earlier, before the main group, to surprise her and her mother? He'd done that before, the energetic and light-hearted man that he was. Thinking this was the case, Yoshiko turned on her heels and bound up the stone steps of the next two levels of castle compound platforms, up to the top level into the white, layered Tenshu keep. "Mother!" Yoshiko slowed to a walk when she met her mother in the keep hallways. The dragon daimyo Asami walked elegantly down the inner wooden stairways, but the pink flushing of her mother's face and the frown in her shapely brow told Yoshiko that Asami was holding back. She didn't want to walk elegantly. Just like Yoshiko, Asami would probably rather kick off her beautiful shoes and swap the tight, formal kimono for hakama. Then, she could bound down the steps to her husband. Yoshiko's lips tugged with amusement. She knew it was what her mother wanted to do. Asami, though a wild child in her youth and a military power's pride now, always put on her best clothes when her husband returned from being away or if they spent any time together. Today, her mother was wearing a long-sleeved kimono her father had commissioned, and it suited her beautifully. Asami's favourite dark indigo colour was decorated with little white and silver moon rabbits, dragons, clouds, and flowers that looked like they were blowing on the wind. It was a work of art. Enhancing the look, Asami's long, sleek black hair had been twisted and pinned behind her head with silver and blue hairpins. Every inch a leader, Yoshiko thought with admiration. The two women entered the throne room and took their seats on a tatami mat dais at the head of the large wooden hall. Yoshiko glanced at the painted wooden frames that made up the walls and ceilings, with scenes of nature and folk tales decorating the room, before turning her gaze to the sliding paper door opposite the dais. The returning group would have to enter formally after a political visit, so to greet them, Asumi knelt on an ornate cushion, with Yoshiko kneeling on her cushion beside her to the left. Yoshiko heard a light panting and twisted to look around at Suki, frantic to make herself look presentable as she knelt in a corner at the back of the dais behind Yoshiko, there if needed. Yoshiko caught Suki's eyes and smiled apologetically for leaving the other woman behind. She'd tried to make it up to her another time. It had been rude. Then she continued to try to analyze her mother. Her mother, who had supposedly spent all morning training her emotions out in the dojo, was now here, looking pristine, hands resting lightly in her lap, fingers faintly brushing over the silk fabric of the edge of her long sleeves. There was something strange in Asumi's eyes Yoshiko couldn't place. A wariness? But nothing that could cause her to act like she did this morning. Yoshiko wondered if the horn announcing her father's return had reassured her mother. Asumi's hearing was as good as hers, if not better. It was that side of the family she got the enhanced abilities from, after all. Her mother must have heard the horn and realized he'd be home safe, and then she'd rush to get ready. Now people were filing into the hall, kneeling on the wooden floors to greet the daimyo's husband and returning samurai and diplomats. The edges of the room were lined with people from the council, diplomats, and castle staff. Usually, Yoshiko would be trying to take sneak peeks at who was there, but today she couldn't take her eyes off her mother. Asumi's breath had become sharp, and her whole body stiffened, fingers gripping the edge of her sleeves. Something's wrong. When the returning riders entered the room, her father wasn't one of them. Instead, samurai entered with their eyes to the floor. One stepped slowly through the throng, his hands held out in front of him with her father's katana resting in his palms. Sweat beaded down the man's sun-kissed face, his jaw was locked, and his movements were tense. Yoshiko could hear his fragile breath as if he were trying to hold it and couldn't. He ambled as if hoping never to reach the dais where the daimyo knelt, waiting to receive her husband's katana. Just his katana? He's not here? When the man reached the dais, he gently laid the sword in front of Yoshiko's mother and fell to his knees to bow so low his forehead touched the wooden floor. He didn't move, not even a twitch of a finger. How did it happen? Her mother's voice cut low and controlled through the silent room. No one dared move. No one dared speak. No one dared even breathe. Not even Yoshiko, whose mind had faltered. She stared at her father's sword lying before them. The man apologized endlessly before he answered her mother. With his forehead pressed against the floor, he recounted a tale of being attacked on the mountain pass as they returned from Shogo. Enemies must have lain in waiting, he told them, for they attacked at night, like evil spirits, killing those who were awake or guarding the tents. Then they disappeared. When the other troops awoke, the attackers had gone, and their comrades were discovered dead. The daimyo's husband was nowhere to be found, gone from his tent, though a bloodstain made them fear the worst. Immediately, they tried to follow tracks that led away, hoping to find him. They failed. Throughout his story, Yoshiko felt weighted down. A loud ringing noise pulsed in her ears until it became difficult to hear, and a painful burning pressure filled her head. The world loomed in on her in a hot blackness when she forced herself to stand, almost swaying, breath caught, staring at the man on the floor. The whole room looked at her. Usually, she'd feel embarrassed and want to hide from so many eyes on her. But today, her focus was her mother, who seemed frozen, staring at her beloved husband's katana. Time stopped as Yoshiko watched her mother, seeing only blank eyes. Life as the daimyo was a political game. One misstep here, even with the news of her dead husband, could alter the balance of the domain. There were rules. Someone could use it as a weakness and take the power for their own. Yoshiko had to get her mother somewhere she could think, but interrupting now would harm her mother's reputation and honor. Before Yoshiko could act, Hovering between the decision of kneeling again or interrupting, Asami opened her mouth, and the hall held its breath. Silence swallowed the room. Finally, the daimyo spoke, her words calculated. "I thank you for bearing such grave news to me. You have all suffered and lost many comrades in this tragic accident." Here, Asami looked at the small returning group, all on their knees and bowing low once more on the floor. It was a much smaller group than had left for the northern region, Yoshiko noticed. Stone-faced, the daimyo continued, choosing her words carefully. "Please, name those who we lost. We should honor them and deliver the heartbreaking news to their families." Asami signaled for a scribe. Names of guards, samurai, council members, and diplomats were listed. A sob came from an elderly man in the corner, whose son had been named one of the fallen. Yoshiko's heart tugged. She knew that man and his son. Her father had recommended the son join him in the talks in Shogo due to his promising political skills. Yoshiko sympathized with the man. What a tragedy that such a good opportunity for the son had resulted in his death. As the names were listed, the silence left the room like a spell being lifted. Murmuring, gasps, sobs, cries of disbelief, and apologies, while hushed, were deafening to Yoshiko's sensitive ears. An emptiness spread through her body, and she tried to hold back the anguish that made her eyes sting with tears and her throat burn. She knew she couldn't react now. Like her mother, both had to be seen strong in front of their people at such a time. Political unrest balanced on how her mother handled this. The kidnap and murder of the daimyo's husband, a man known well around the domain and surrounding regions, was a dangerous move, even in feudal times. "Isn't this meant to be a time of peace?" she thought. Chinen's warning of the risk of war whispered into Yoshiko's mind, and the emptiness grew inside her. The feudal times had lasted hundreds of years, but in the last couple of generations, with the hard work of her mother and grandmother, there had been signs of the regions being more able to work together under the new shogunate. At least, the regions around here, closest to the home of the shogun in Shogo, seemed civil. Was that temporary? Were the feudal times not a thing of the past? Taking another look at Asami's posture and lack of reaction made Yoshiko feel danger. Senses deep within her sounded alarm bells, and all remains of tears froze. Realizing she was still standing, she forced herself to bow to her mother, acknowledging her mother's loss. The room bowed with her. Something stung behind her as if someone in the room was glaring at them and wishing them ill. She tried to catch her mother's eyes to communicate some sort of plan or reason to leave, but Asami's eyes were elsewhere. They had to battle it through. "They killed him," Asami whispered once they finally escaped the throne room and the watchful eyes of others. They were in her mother's tea room, just the two of them, on the ground floor of the tenshu, where opening sliding doors looked over a small private garden kept exclusively for the daimyo and her family. Today, the sliding doors were closed for privacy, and Yoshiko glanced sadly at the doors, wishing for the stability and zen that looking out at that small garden gave. Instead, they knelt in silence on the tatami, with cups of hot genmaicha on a low kotatsu table between them. Yoshiko looked at her mother. Asami was inspecting something she clutched in her hands, but Yoshiko couldn't see what it was. Some sort of paper, she thought, by the sound of it. "They killed him," Asami said again, a little louder this time, turning the paper over in her hands where Yoshiko could now see it. "Do you really think Shogo would attack them? They've been kind to us since you were a child. The shogun, Lord Kazuhito, is like an uncle to you. He wouldn't attack us." Not Kazuhito. It was them. They lied. Yoshiko sighed, wondering who them was, and looked at her mother through numbed eyes, certain her mother was confused, baffled by the shock. "But Mama..." She only called Asami this when they were alone. She reached her hand across the kotatsu to offer her hand. Asami didn't seem to notice. Yoshiko kept it there for her anyway and sought her mother's eyes. He said they were attacked. Asami shook her head slowly, and her narrow black eyes met Yoshiko's with a dark look, unlike anything she'd seen before on her mother's face. He was lying. Asami brought her arms up to the table and put the paper down, pulling down her sleeves instinctively to cover her hands, then picking up her tea in both hands and taking a sip. Yoshiko pulled her arm back and listened. There are cues when people are lying. It didn't make sense only certain people were killed, those who had either been close to Hitoshi and me, or those unwaveringly loyal to Hie. She gestured to the paper on the table with her hand. I received this from Hitoshi a few days ago, by messenger. It contains a warning of some members of his party. When the messenger came last night to tell us Hitoshi was returning early, I knew he was wary. They killed him, Yoshiko. Someone on the council has betrayed us. They were the only ones who knew Hitoshi's change of plans. Both women looked at Hitoshi's katana, lying on the tatami in his favorite seating place, where he could easily look out onto the garden when the sliding doors were opened. Asami had placed it there when they had entered the tea room, a symbol of his presence. Yoshiko stared at it, miserable, unable to feel or think anything. Either way, he's gone, she mourned. He'll never sit in that spot again. They sat in silence. When Asami finally spoke again, she was calculated. She spoke quietly, so quietly only Yoshiko with her heightened hearing from the family curse could hear, and Yoshiko knew it was so no prying ears, should they be outside the room, would hear. We must pretend we don't know. It will put us in danger. We must go into mourning, as expected, and show no sign of mistrust. We must be careful, and find out who on the council is our enemy, and anyone with them. Show no sign of weakness. They will grab onto that and pull until they find a reason or a way to kill us too. My lovely daughter, go nowhere without your most trusted guards. Go nowhere without your blades. Go nowhere without your full mind and senses ready. If anything seems out of the ordinary, you must tell me instantly. There's an enemy in the castle. At that moment, Yoshiko understood a little more of what peace had meant to their region, and why it was so important to bring an end to the feudal era, as Asami was helping the shogun do. How strange it has changed so suddenly. She wondered about mentioning that morning's incident with Suki, or Haruki going missing, or whether those were the sorts of things her mother had meant at all. Before she could decide whether either matter counted, a small sob erupted from her mother's lips, and Asami's shoulders slumped, shaking with tears. Yoshiko leapt up and tumbled to her mother's side, holding her close. The woman who always seemed so strong and assured, untouchable, bold, felt small and frail. Resting her mother's head on her shoulder, Yoshiko held Asami close as the daimyo wept silently, afraid of letting anyone else hear her cries. And, as Yoshiko's shoulder soaked with tears, the bitter weeping of her mother bringing a sting to her eyes too, Yoshiko tried to hold her tears back, trying to comfort her heartbroken mother, who had lost the gentle life partner she'd loved with all her soul.
And that's the end of chapter 2. As I was reading, I actually caught a little capitalization error, probably something most people wouldn't even notice, but I'm a bit strict on myself with that, so I've marked it up to fix it in the next edition. Honestly, as an author, you never stop noticing things you'd like to tweak. Little typos, just easy things that anyone can miss, even if you've had several rounds of editing and 3 different editors look at it. I'm always looking at it and finding myself thinking, I could write this bit better now. But that's what writing is like. You grow with every book. Each new project or book sharpens your style and your skills. You learn more about how you want to write. For example, right now, I'm deep into self-editing my standalone Noble Bright fantasy, Iron Angels, and I'm really obsessed. I'm already on chapter 11 for editing, and while I planned for it to be a bit shorter than my previous books, there's just so much to explore. especially with the Iron Angels and their interactions with humans, that I think it might actually end up to be a similar length after all. But I can't wait to share more about that process with you while continuing to read Origin Curse on here, so come back next time for Chapter 3. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and follow me, Sarah Kate Ishii, on all major social media platforms. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I'll try to answer them in a future episode. Thanks for being here. Happy reading. Stay creative. I'll see you next time.